If you looked at your outline, the topic today is sin and judgment, or temptation. I'm not trying to do that in my most ominous voice. I'll do it again. Sin, temptation. It's scary. It's heavy stuff. Not the way to really start off a book that you're studying is to go into sin and temptation, because those are heavy words. Those are rather culturally loaded words that I want to unpack a little bit to see what James says about them. I'll get to those words. And if you call yourself a Christian, or if you're not and you don't know what you believe, you're still seeking it out, those words are going to be of vast importance to you, how you live your life. So we have to understand it. And I think what you're going to see today, I hope, is something that I've never seen before after I've read this passage countless times. Something about what temptation really is and how the gospel enables us to deal with it in our lives, as well as sin. But first, I got to do something. We're starting off this series on the book of James. And throughout the history of the church, James, this book, this epistle, this letter, has gotten a rather bad knock. Has gotten not a fair shake for the most part. It's believe it or not, a somewhat controversial book. It's a book that most people a lot of people used to not believe that it should be even in the Bible. You remember Martin Luther, the great church fathers, wrote, he calls it famously the straw epistle, meaning he takes all the letters written by Paul in the Gospels and he says, those have weight because they talk about things like grace and forgiveness and love. But he looked at James, as many other people have done throughout history, and said, James is what we call all about works. James seems to be, on the surface when you read it, about performance, about your performance leading to the acceptance of God. And I'll be real honest, it's easy for me as a pastor, now doing this for more than 4 years, giving sermons almost every Sunday, to preach on books like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. Because they're all lovey-dovey, for the most part. There's a whole lot of love going on. There's a whole lot of good feelings, good vibes. I mean, it's about somebody giving up their life for you. And it's almost as equally easy for me to preach on letters that Paul wrote, because those are dripping with things like grace and forgiveness, unmerited grace. Everybody wants that. That sounds good to everybody. I don't know anybody in the world who say, no, I'd rather not have unmerited grace. It doesn't fit. But you get to James, and it's real easy, especially in the first chapter, what we're going to look at today, this topic of sin and temptation. And it's really easy to look at the book of James and just say, well, this is all about performance. It's all about me working my way into the love of God. No. James is infinitely more than that. And infinitely different than that. See, the book of James, what we're calling this, is a blueprint, if you can see that small little text, for making faith work, not for working towards faith. There's a big difference there. James, and this is what I want you to do, if you're going to be with us for the next series, this is going to take a few weeks, months leading into the Easter holiday. I want you to ask this one question. This is the one question you should be asking about your life, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, whether you believe in God or you don't know what you believe. You should be asking, so what? So what? Yeah, I'm a Christian. I've gone to church. I believe in Jesus. I know he died for my sins, and I know I have eternal forgiveness and salvation. So what? What does it mean for you tomorrow when you go to work? What does it mean for you tomorrow when you have to deal with your spouse? What does it mean for you tomorrow when you have to step into that classroom again? So what? And James, probably more than any other book in the New Testament, answers that question. So what? His, more than almost any book in the New Testament, is a practical book of wisdom for how to live out your faith. He says later on, to paraphrase, yeah, you believe, so do the demons, so what? How does it make you different? How does it make the way you use your money differently? We'll see that in a couple weeks. How does it make the way you talk to people differently? We'll see that in a few weeks as well. How does it make the way you look at the poor and the needy around you change? How does it change? See, it's real easy to go through the book of James and look at it as a case of morality. And he does talk about works, and I could go into, and I will unpack it in the next couple weeks, of why he's not a works-based guy, why he's grace-based. First of all, he never uses the Greek word works, erga, and he never uses it synonymously with nomo, which is law, which is what Paul does. As a way to say this, James is fighting an entirely different battle in the Christian life. Paul is fighting against the idea that you have to perform, you have to do certain ritualistic behaviors in order to get accepted into the club, into the church. And James isn't battling that at all. James is rather saying, you believe, good, now what? What does it do to you? How does it change you? Do you appreciate, he would say, I think, if you were here today, do you appreciate the cost of the grace that was paid for you? And only to the extent that you appreciate the cost of the grace that was given to you, will then you be able to pay it forward. Only then will you have a blueprint for how to live out your life practically, how to use your money, how to deal with the poor and the needy, how to talk to other people, how to get along in church. All of it's in here. All of it's incredibly practical, and all of it points right back to grace in the gospel. And I want to show you that, because if you start off first by looking at James as just a book about works and performance, you'll miss the mark entirely. James, rather, is a reminder that you, if you say you're a Christian, were bought at a price, and it was a great price. And only to the extent that you know the price to which you bought will your life start to truly change. There's a quote that I whip out every once in a while. It's been about 3 years. So if we were here 3 years ago, you heard me do this. And I only put a little snippet in your outline. I want to read this because I wanted to read from somebody who knew what costly grace really was. And so somebody whose life it really changed. And if you've heard me talk about him, he's obviously a mentor of mine. I'm a very, very, very big fan of his. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, opposed the Nazi regime in Germany. He was a pastor. And he knew costly grace because it would end up costing him his life when he went into concentration camp as in opposition of the Nazi regime. And here's what he writes. And here's what you need to know first and foremost before we get into this whole sin and temptation thing, because, oh, that's juicy. We got a lot to unpack. Hear these words. He says, cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. He goes on to contrast this with what he calls costly grace. He says, costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, to buy which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out his eye, which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. He finishes by saying, costly grace. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his own Son. Ye were bought at a price. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for your life, but delivered him up for us. You see, what I want you to know when you ask the question, so what? And you should ask that question. So I'm a Christian, so what? What James does, very practically, takes you and me and he turns our heads and he says, that's the cost. Know that cost, otherwise you'll never be different. You'll have cheap grace, not costly grace. You have grace without forgiveness, grace without sin. Why did I do that long intro? Well, because it's the first series in the sermon in this series. But what I need us to see, what I need you to see, is that as we pour over this book of James in the coming weeks, I want you to have an appreciation for the cost of this grace. James wants you to have an appreciation. And you'll see, he'll point to Jesus and he'll say, if you don't know this, you'll never be able to tackle the problems of your life. And today we're going to look at two problems in our lives, temptation and sin. And if you know my preaching style and you've been here for any number of years, I think sin is probably the word I've used least up here. Because it's a loaded word. It's a word that most modern day people, especially if you're a modern day skeptic, would say that's antiquated. That's old fashioned. They had sin back then at that culture, but you know, and even then, I'll even push it a little bit further. Say you're a Christian and you go, yes, I'm a sinner. Then somebody says, well, what sins did you commit this week? We don't talk about that. It's a heavy, heavy word, sin, temptation. But what I want you to see today is that temptation, consequently sin, is so much different, so much more than simply breaking the rules. It's not religiosity. It's not just doing the wrong thing. James points to something much more insidious, much deeper and more profound. And I really had never seen it before, although I preached on this passage quite a few times. And it comes in the metaphor that he gives about birth. But we'll get to that in a second. First, I want to do something with you here. Can I do an exercise here? Because I've gotten this question a lot. Why does God allow temptation in my life? Why does God allow temptation? You know, if God didn't want me to look at that thing on the computer, then he wouldn't have given me the money to buy the computer in the first place. So why did God allow that? James says he'll have none of that. And he makes a clear distinction between two things, testing and temptation. And oh, people, you got to know the difference. And I'll put it this way, you can follow along in your outline. There's the product of testing and there's the problem of temptation. Another way you can look at it is this. If that doesn't work for you, the P's and the P's, testing is for you. Temptation is from you. What do I mean by that? Well, here's this. The narrative of the Bible. Go back to any Old Testament story. You can go back to Abraham. You can go back to Job. You can go back to the prophet Hosea. Go back and back and back. And God is always testing. And if you look back at this passage, at the beginning in verse 12, James says, blessed is the one who endures when they are tested. Not if. When. It's as if James is saying, it's not a matter of when God will, or if God will test you, it's a matter of when he will test you. He does test you. And the question you should be asking is, that sounds horrible. Why would I want a God who tests me? That sounds maniacal and tyrannical. But let me push it out a little bit further. There's two fundamental types of tests. And the test of God is always one. And it's always for you. And it's always for us. See, this is what James says. He says, blessed is the man who's tested and endured. He's going to get tested. And if he endures, he gets the crown of life. What exactly that is, I don't really know. Sorry, don't know. Figure it out. But you'll get it, and it's good, and it'll make you better. Because God says, listen, the way I test you is unlike any other test. I test you to improve you, not to disapprove you. I test you to construct you, not deconstruct you. Can we do a little exercise here? Okay? We had fun with this one time before. I kind of had to change it up a little bit because some of you guys are really smart. So let's change this up a lot. I'm going to give you two tests. I know, Sunday morning, you didn't come to church to take a test. Too bad. It's two tests. They're 3 question sheets. It's really not a big deal. If you got a pen and paper, come on. I know some of you are hyper competitive, and you're going to want to get this test right. And this is very, very important because your whole future, no, it doesn't write on this test at all. Here's the test. Ready? I'm going to give you 2 tests to prove what I'm saying here. After I get through this. There you go. Okay. It's 3 questions. All you got to do is answer them. And I'll give you some time. Take your time. Oh, the wheels are turning now. I got you. Okay, good. This is nice. Wakes people up a little bit. Testing on Sunday morning. Take a stab at it. Come on, have some fun. What's the smallest country in the world? What is the distance from the Earth to the moon? And how many elements are there on the periodic table? Okay, we're all done? Hands up, hands down, pencils down. Don't Google, by the way. This is church. There's no cheating. Don't Google it. Now listen, that's one type of test. And that type of test probably made you feel a little bit angry. I can see some daggers from some people. Like, why is this pastor testing me this morning? Why ask these insane questions that mean nothing? See, this test is bound, if it was longer especially, bound to make you feel inferior. It's bound to humble you. It's bound to say, I don't know all this stuff. You get a little nervous if you take a test like this. Now, let's take test number 2. You ready? Test number 2. I'll ask the questions this time, and you can write them down. What is the smallest country in the world by land size? Okay. What's the distance from the Earth to the Moon in kilometers? And how many elements are listed on the periodic table? Okay. Why? What's the difference between the second test and the first? The second test, now you have the answers, is made to build you up. It's an open book test. It's meant to improve you. The first test, when you look at those first 3 questions, if you were game enough to answer them this morning, if you weren't totally upset at me or confused as to why I was doing this, the first test probably made you feel like, whoa, I really don't know some of this stuff. But the second test, it's infinitely easier. Why? Because it's made to made you better. It's made to improve you, not disapprove you. Not to make you feel inferior, but to make you feel superior. It's an open book test, which we all know and love from school. Now listen. What James, it says, and you can see this all throughout Scripture, is that there's a big difference between testing and temptation. God will test, but it's meant to improve you. And it's from the outside, and He brings it. And if you don't like that kind of God, well, sorry, wait till the end of the sermon, I'll put it back to grace, and then you'll like Him again, I'm pretty sure. Yes, He's a God you test, James says. But if you endure, you get the cross of life, meaning you're improved. But, James says, in this passage, he says, don't get confused between testing and temptation. There's a huge difference. Testing can lead to temptation, and so you say, what is temptation? And he gives this wonderful metaphor, and I'm gonna push this metaphor today. Maybe you've read this passage and it hasn't really tinkered around your head. He uses very sensual, very sexual language to talk about what temptation does in our lives. He gives this metaphor of a woman or somebody being pregnant and giving birth. Now, why would he do that? What James is trying to say, and he does say it here, he says, don't think that God tempts you. He doesn't tempt you. All the temptation comes from what? This word, he says this word, your own desires. Your own desires. This is a really interesting Greek word, and it comes through the New Testament many times, and you may have heard me talk about it. This long word called epithemia. Desire. Epithemia. And I've talked about it many other times in sermons because it constantly keeps coming up. As the root of sin is epithemia. Let me break down the word for you. E-P-I is where we obviously get things like epicenter. The middle, the greatest part, the greatest center. Epic. An epic movie, an epic title, an epic film. Great, superior. See, the English translation that he gives here is just a little bit weak. He's saying that temptation comes from your own desires. It doesn't come from outside you. Don't blame anything else. You can't. James would say, don't confuse the circumstances of your temptation with the cause. The cause is in each one of us. And he says it starts with your own desires. It starts with an epithemia. And another way to look at this is what we would call an over-desire for something. Let that sink in. What James is saying here is that sin is so much more than just breaking a rule. Sin is not just wanting bad things, it's wanting things too badly. It's not just wanting bad things, it's wanting things too badly. Look, this word in Greek is completely neutral. It has no negative or positive connotation until you pair it with an object. I know, here's your grammar lesson for the morning. And when he pairs it with this, he's saying, our desires, be they good things, work, family, career, reputation, success, comfort, companionship, love, children. Those are our desires, but when they become an epi-desire, an over-desire, he says, that's when the birth process starts. It's an over-desire. And it leads to the conceptions. You see this? He says it starts off with our desires. And be they good, be they neutral, be they bad, if we make them an over-desire, if we put the epithemy of our lives above God himself, what happens is this birth process starts. Something inside of us begins to grow and grow like a child would. And then it gives birth, he says, to sin. Let me make it real practical for you. I know some of you have jobs, or have had jobs, as I have had, where you've been asked to lie or cut a corner. Now, we would say in the church, well, that's a sin, right? In the Ten Commandments, don't bear false witness. And it would be easy for you to say, well, my boss told me if I don't lie on this particular budget report, then I'm going to get fired. I'm going to lose my job. But you see what you've just done. You've blamed the circumstances for the sin, not the cause for the sin. What's the cause? I don't know. You have to look deep within your heart. Maybe it's the fear that you have of losing a job. Maybe it's the fear of losing face to your employer. I don't know what it is. But don't blame the circumstances on that sin. Look at the root cause. Look at the own desires, your desires, your over desires, which have grown now. And they've given birth. If you examine your heart, your own heart, I can't do that for you this morning. I don't got enough time. But if you start to pour through your own heart and go, what are my possible over desires? I guarantee you that you will find that that's the place where you sin the most. If your desire is for companionship and affection, you'll most likely sin in that regard because you want it so badly. You see? It's not wanting the bad thing, although that is sin too. But it's wanting things too badly, James says. It's having epidesires that give birth into sin, that give birth into death. And this is the part where you could ask me as a pastor, and you'd be well within your rights. Okay, pastor, you said, summation. Temptation comes from inside of me. It gets born. It festers. It comes out as sin. I sin about the things that I love too much, the things that I love and care for too much about God. I have epicenters in my heart where God ought to be, and it turns into sin. But then this last part, James says, he turns it into death. Wait a second. All I did was lie a little bit. And that means death? Like, wait a second. All I did was look at the pictures I wasn't supposed to look at. All I did was tell that person what I shouldn't have told them. All I did was betray that confidence of that person. That's all I did. How does that possibly get you to death? Here's how. And it's a story that I like to read from one of my favorite books. And I'm going to read it. It's not in your outline, so it's story time. Sunday morning, close your eyes, get story time. It comes from the book The Great Divorce, as C.S. Lewis wrote it. I've quoted it often. And here's the story. There's a narrator, and he's watching these interactions between two types of people up in heaven. These ghosts that come up from hell, and they're met by solid people, they're called. Solid people who are trying to convince them to accept the grace of God, to take steps towards the mountain, what he calls heavenly place. And C.S. Lewis is not trying to be theologically accurate about how you get to heaven. Don't get confused. What he's trying to do is show how sin looks when it gets confronted with grace. And he's trying to show the consequences of sin. And so all throughout the book, there's these, they call them thin ghosts. And they're whisked up to the footsteps of heaven, and they meet the solid people who are like angel characters. And the solid people come to them, and they try to tell them, this is what you need. You need to come with me now. And time and time and time again, the thin ghost come up with excuse after excuse after excuse. They say things like, well, I'll go if I'm needed. And the solid person says, you're not needed here. You're loved here. And there's one interaction where the narrator of the book is walking with what he calls his teacher. And he notices this interaction between two people, one thin ghost and one solid person. And here's how it goes. He says, at this moment, we are suddenly interrupted by the thin voice of a ghost talking at an enormous speed. Looking behind us, we saw the creature, and it was addressing one of the solid people. And it was doing so too busily to notice us. Every now and then, the solid spirit tried to get in a word, but without success. The ghost talked with something like this. Oh, my dear, I've had such a dreadful time. I don't know how I ever got here at all. I was coming with Eleanor Stone, and we'd arranged the whole thing, and we were to meet at the corner of Sink Street. I made it perfectly plain because I knew what she was like, and I told her, once I told her 100 times, I would not meet her outside that dreadful Marjorie Banks woman, not after the way she treated me. First of all, I didn't think I was going to be comfortable with all I'd been through, but she turned out to be so changed, absolutely selfish and not a particle of sympathy for anyone but herself, as I once said to her. I do not think I'm entitled to a little consideration because you at least lived out your time. But I oughtn't to have been here for years and years and years and years yet. But of course I'm forgetting. You don't know. I was murdered, simply murdered. That man should never have operated on me. I ought to be alive today. And they simply starved me in that dreadful nursing home, and no one ever came to near me. The shrill, monotonous whine died away as the speaker, still accompanied by the great, bright Patience at her side, moved out of hearing. I read that intentionally fast, and here's why. The teacher says, "What troubles you, my son?" The narrator replies, "I'm troubled, sir, because that unhappy creature doesn't seem to me to be the sort of soul that ought to be in danger of damnation. She isn't wicked. She's only a silly, garrulous old woman who has got into a habit of grumbling. And one feels that a little kindness and rest and change would put her all right." The teacher replies, "That it once she was. That is maybe what she still is. If so, she certainly will be cured. But the whole question is now whether she is a grumbler." The narrator replies, "I should have thought there was no doubt about that. Of course she's a grumbler." "Aye," the teacher said, "but ye misunderstand me. The question is whether she is a grumbler or only a grumble. If there is a real woman, even the least trace of one inside there in the grumbling, it can be brought to life once again. If there's one wee spark under all those ashes, we'll blow it till the whole pile is red and clear." And the narrator responds, "But how can there be a grumble without a grumbler?" And teacher closes, "The whole difficulty of understanding hell is that the thing to be understood is so nearly nothing at all. But you will have had experiences in your life. It begins with a grumbling mood, and yourself distinct far from it, perhaps even criticizing it. And you yourself in a dark hour may will that mood and embrace it. You can repent and come out of it again. But there may come a day when you can do that no longer. Then there will be no left you to criticize the mood, nor even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine." You see, the woman in the story, she sounded like a grumbler. "How dare they do that to me? I deserve better. I'm entitled to more. I shouldn't even be here. Nobody listens to me. Nobody cares about me. Nobody's come to see me." And she's a grumbler over and over again. But the teacher says, "I now. Yes, it started as just a grumble, but now she's become the grumble. It starts as a lie, but now he or she has become the liar." See, when James says that temptation gives birth to sin and sin to death, what he's saying is that the small things that you and I take and put at the center of our lives, the good things that have merit and worth and are beautiful, but we make them bigger than God. We make them bigger than everything else. We look for that to give us our value, that to give us our sense of worth. If we hold on to that, we're happy. If it goes away, we're miserable and crushed. That's an epidesire. And slowly it will start to eat you away. You won't just put work at the center of your life. You'll become nothing but your work. You won't just put the family at the center of your life. You'll become nothing but your family. You see what James is saying? He says sin is not just breaking the rules. If it was that easy, somebody could slap you on the wrist and say, "Go back and try it again." No, he says, temptation is something born inside of you and me that grows and eventually takes us over. It becomes an object of pure beauty that we place in our lives that most of us don't even know is there. Our job, our children, our relationships, our schooling, whatever it may be. And epithemia is just that. It's a desire, but it's your own desire that you have now put in the super place above where God should be. Now, it's as if you've held the object in pure beauty. How do you fix it? If I left you there and I said, okay, every time temptation comes up in your life and you're tempted to sin, because we all are, and I said, next time it happens, just say no. I will not do it. Try it. Try that next time. That's called willpower. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a whole lot of it. And it waxes and it wanes, and I'm guaranteeing some of you are in the bucket with me. Willpower may get you to lunch today, no further. There are times that sin comes up in your life and temptation where you do have to just say no and walk away. And you're going to have to put your foot down and say, absolutely not. But if that's the only way that you combat temptation and sin, James says, you're missing the whole boat. And it comes in the last part of this passage, this really paradoxical, cryptic phase when he says that every good gift perfectly is coming down from heaven. It says the Father of lights with nothing, no shadow due to change. What does he mean by that? Thomas Chalmers, an old British pastor, put it this way. I put the quote in your bulletin. I don't have time to outline. I don't have time to read it all. I'll paraphrase it. What he says is this. It's a beautiful sermon called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. You should look it up. Isn't that a nice title? I wish I could title my sermons that way. The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. And what he says is this. It's very interesting. He says, if you want to take that object of beauty that you've held up in the place of God and you want to remove it, willpower alone will never do that. It'll creep its way back into that place. He says, in order to replace the object of beauty that you place your value in and your worth, whatever it may be, you'll need to replace it with another object of greater beauty. You'll need to see something more beautiful than the thing that you have put into the epicenter of your heart. You see, the answer to temptation is not, no, I'll never do that again. Really? Come on. Really? We all know you're going to do that thing again. Because it's not just breaking the rule, it's breaking the relationship. And Chalmers says, if you want the relationship back, take that object and look at something more beautiful. Here's what's something more beautiful. It is the good and perfect gift that came down from heaven. What is James talking about, I wonder? He says, every good and gift comes down from heaven. There was someone who did come down from heaven. For you. And he left the kingdom of the Father of lights. And James says in this passage about temptation and sin that no matter how many times you and I fail, God can never turn his back on us. You know when this phrase, no shadow due to change or no shadow due to turning, I wish I had more time to unpack it. It was, in this time, it was the ultimate way you snubbed someone. If you're talking with somebody and you turn around and you cast your shadow on them, what that says is, you're cut off from me. You're dead to me. It means that person has wronged you to the nth degree that you turn and put your shadow on them. I mean, even today, if somebody turns while you're talking to them mid-sentence, that's pretty rude. But in this time, it meant, get away. You're dead to me. And James says to you and me, the God of the universe can never put his shadow on you. Why? Because he already put his shadow on that good and perfect gift, Jesus Christ. On the cross, of course, we know Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know what happens next? A shadow comes. Darkness. On him, not you. So that you know your Lord will never be able to cast his shadow on you. Why? Because he's already done it on that one and good and perfect gift that came from above in Jesus Christ himself. Now, start to put that as the object of your beauty. See him stripped so that you're clothed. See him beaten so that you're spared. See him killed so that you live. That's all I can do this morning to tell you how to deal with temptation and sin. Whatever object you've put up there that you cannot shake in your life and you've never been able to get over this, it's probably because you've been looking at it as an external circumstance, a habit that needs to be broken, instead of the relationship that's broken. And what Chalmers would say and what James would say is, look to a more beautiful object, Jesus himself. There's nothing more beautiful than that. There's nothing that will unseat the over-desire in your heart than to put your over-desire back on him. Because he did it for you. Be ravished by that love. And I say ravished because Jesus wants to be your spouse. He wants to be intimate. Choose to let temptation grow and be birthed inside of you. or choose to get back into the marriage with him. Sing, Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearest water roll, while the tempest still is high. Hide me, O Savior, hide, till the storm of life is past. Safe into the haven guide, O receive my soul at last. Plenteous grace with thee is found, grace to cover all my sin. Let the healing streams abound, and keep me pure within. Thou of life, the fountain art, freely let me take of thee. Spring thou up within my heart, rise to all eternity. Because the shadow was put on him, you and I this morning can sing, thou of life, the fountain art, freely let me take of thee. Spring thou up within my heart and rise to all eternity. I point you to Jesus every week because that's all I got. It's all you need. Nothing more, nothing less than to see him as beautiful because he saw you as beautiful. Put that as the object in the middle of your heart. Go in silence now and pray over this amazing King and what he would do and what he did do for you.